good evening and welcome to Michigan State University's Athletic Training Lecture Series. My name is Tracy Kovassin and I'm a professor and the Director of Athletic Training Program at MSU. Myself and Dr. Chris Coons will be moderating tonight's lecture. First, I would like to thank Mike Strauss for his continuous support and funding our Athletic Training Lecture Series. Mike completed his undergraduate degree at MSU and his graduate degree in physician assistant at Emory University. He completed an internship with the New York Giants NFL team and worked for the U.S. Olympic Committee Sports Medicine Department in Colorado Springs for 2 years prior to joining MSU. For over the past 20 years, Mike has been the PA at MSU Sports Medicine. He's also the director for the Athletic Training Residency Program. Again, we'd like to thank Mike Strauss for all of his support in sponsoring our Athletic Training Lecture Series. Tonight, we have 3 amazing speakers that will speak on wearable sensors for student athletes. Each speaker will present for about 30 to 35 minutes, with all questions taking place after each speaker has presented. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the question and answer on the webinar. Our first speaker is Dr. Billy Burghardt. Dr. Burghardt earned all 3 of his degrees at MSU, including his PhD in kinesiology last year. Dr. Burghardt is a certified strength and conditioning specialist and the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association and the National Strength and Coaching Association certificates as well. Dr. Burghardt just completed his 11th year on as full-time staff at MSU. He is currently the Director of Football Sports Science. Prior to his current role, he was on as strength and conditioning coach for the Spartans and was named the Associate Strength and Conditioning Coach in June of 2018. He also added the duties of Football Analytics Coordinator in 2018, a role that includes collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and disseminating results of the Catapult GPS data for the staff. And he moved into this role of Director of Football Sports Science full-time under head coach Mel Tucker. I'd like to thank Dr. Burghardt for presenting, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, first, thank you very much for having me. And I do have to say and wish, I'm assuming just about everybody on here is an athletic trainer. So happy Athletic Training Month, month of March. I don't think there's one yet for sports science. So I'm leaning towards starting that in July or June. Better weather. I don't have to compete with St. Patty's Day or March Madness. So, but anyway, happy Athletic Training Month. I do, in sports science, you start blending different roles together. So you see the strength and conditioning side, you see the sports medicine side, the coaching side, and it's really truly remarkable the hours and the time and the demands that you all put in, and at times life-saving demands. So really appreciate everything you do here. My hope for the overview of the quick little blurb here is I'm coming at it with everybody that you really haven't seen what it is, maybe what sports science, applied sports science in a way, in the college or the collegiate setting. I'm trying to give you some take-home points, just some broad overview topics of that. And then for any high school or younger athletic trainers, and you want to try and maybe apply some of this on different resource constraints to your level, we try and do that as well, or try and give you a couple tips and tools along the way. I do apologize at the end of this. I got to jump off pretty quick. I have 3 children that if you don't put them to bed right at the right time, your whole night's ruined. So I'm going to try and get that done, but happy to respond to any questions and emails and all that kind of stuff that we have going forward. So I don't want this to be a one-off piece as well. I will try and get back to every single person that has a question. And if you want continuous chats, feel free to hit me up as well. So I'm going to share my screen and just kind of dive into it. And we'll get rolling. So again, like I said, an introduction to wearable technology in a way. So this is going to focus on the different types of tech that's applied for the sports setting. We can go on a whole nother track and a whole nother few hours for weight room type technology, or even some of the equipment that you're more used to and probably have more experience than I do in the athletic training room as well. So this one is geared towards on the field in the sport of play. So main objectives. We're going to overview some of these techs. We'll discuss different applications across different levels here. And I'll try and give you a few examples as well. And then hopefully we can get to some questions. So I do need to put a disclaimer out there. I'm not endorsing any products in particular. We have certain ones that we use here. I'll talk about those, but I'll also give you a couple other alternatives should you want to look around and see what else is out there. Again, the examples are from the ones we use, so some numbers and things like that might be different. And then again, each segment I'll try and give you a couple resources that can steer you in a certain direction. There's really not a ton in terms of wearable technology, a bunch of different options. There's a few here and there, and those kind of depend on segment and what you're really looking to do in particular. So, excuse me, this question encompasses everything I do. So what are the demands of competition? If you think to track or swimming, if I ask you what's your event in track, you say I'm a 100-meter runner, I'm an 800-meter runner, or I do the 4x1 hurdles. Swimming, I'm a 100-meter backstroke. But when I say, what are your actual physical demands of football or basketball or soccer? Up until a certain point, we don't really know. There's some observations, but the finite, counting of changes of direction, distance, speeds, all those sorts of things, the true demands of the sport was barely just kind of guessed on observation for a long time. So how your sport requires you to perform, what those game demands are, then leads us back to how do we set up practice the right way, and then how do we set up our conditioning program to meet practice to ultimately meet our high performance on game day. That's essentially the objective. So measuring activity, a few different ways we can do it. There's what are generally termed internal methods, which include heart rate or rating of perceived exertion, which we'll get into a little bit more in a minute. Those are internal measures. And then we have external measures. Those are your GPS, or LPS is a local positioning system, or we can use just the baseline accelerometer and gyroscopes. And they give you different measures of data. You could say in a perfect world with unlimited resources and unlimited staff, you might try and collect all of these to give you sort of a holistic picture as to what an athlete is going through. For example, a certain training session, if repeated, and we see heart rate over time go down, then perhaps they're getting in better condition. If they report feelings that the session was easier than before, and they still met the same type of physical demands, then we could assume or suggest that they're getting in better condition. At the same time, we can know exactly what they did by measuring GPS data, distance, those sorts of things. And then we can also measure pitches, jumps, contacts, foot strikes, all that sorts of things objectively in a way. So 3 of these, heart rate, GPS, accelerometer, and gyroscopes, will be fairly objective measures of measuring workload. And then subjective would be gauging by the athletes and asking them, how do you feel about the session overall today? That's a very broad overview for you. Now, we can assess these individually. So you could at one point be wearing a polar heart rate strap, be asked a question on a clipboard. You could have a Garmin GPS watch on, and you could have various accelerometers measuring different accelerations of different limbs and that sort of thing. Or we can group them into single wearable devices, which is really the nice piece for us. And we do that. We happen to use Catapult, and there's a couple other systems, but it is an integrated device. So it has GPS / LPS. And going into LPS, GPS is global positioning satellite system. So that's like what your car uses, your phone, all that sort of stuff. Local positioning system comes in handy if you're in a basketball arena, volleyball, You're in an ice rink. You're in an indoor football setting where you don't have access to the satellites that our military happens to put in the sky. You can install a local system that will track movement as well. And it turns out on the local positioning system that it's actually far more accurate, down to a couple centimeters of calculation on your distances and whatnot, compared to global positioning satellites, which is actually a bit restricted based on the military, because they don't want to give you complete finite or complete perfect data of where your car is and this sort of thing for security reasons. So we happen to have both. Very, very glad we do. We only got that a couple years ago, because that gives us a look at speeds and running velocities and distances covered at different velocities, indoors as well as outdoors. And when you live in the state of Michigan, or you try and go on 2 turf fields, one's indoors, one's outdoors, it helps us make sure we get the most bang for our buck there. So that's the first piece it has. It also has a 3-dimensional accelerometer. So you'll get front, back, side to side, up and down, essentially changes of position of the unit. Gyroscope, so rotation, which is very handy especially for quarterback throws, potentially with kickers and that sort of thing. It has a magnetometer. It's heart rate capable, and then we can track it. It's Bluetooth and then ultra wideband, so it has Bluetooth connectivity. So you can track these on your phone, on an iPad, or connect it to a laptop, which gives it some portability as well. And then the other company that I mentioned on these devices is Stat Sports, and the two companies have very similar products. So there's a couple different ones at different levels. If you go to your left, you have Catapult's sort of indoor-outdoor unit. That's the Vector. They have Clear Sky, which is an indoor-only unit, which is smaller because it doesn't have the GPS component. But that's primarily worn with, basketball or volleyball or sports that are really never going to be outside in their training. And then you also have a high school or a semi-professional level one called Catapult One, which is a little bit restricted in the number of metrics you get from the Vector, but is priced at a better point for those companies, for those, those levels and budgets. And then Stat Sports has a very similar thing in their Sonra and Apex. And then one more to point out too, that our teams have used in the past is the Polar Team Pro. So this has a GPS component and the integrated heart rate. The Catapult and Stat Sport companies have garments that are similar to a heart rate strap, but it's built into an overall shirt or sports bra, so you can pick up heart rate by that connection as well. So a couple different links and whatnot for you to look at if you're interested. So those were objective measures. The subjective one, perceived exertion. We kind of mentioned that the same objective workout, if we're running 2 miles, may feel harder to different people. And then in addition, that same workout, like I mentioned before, could feel harder to a person over time or feel easier to the same person over time. This has been the predominant way to measure workload, if you will, this sort of volume and intensity of activity in the research, especially early on, because it was so cost effective. Is really just walk up, ask someone how hard it was, write it down on a piece of paper, maintain a spreadsheet, and kind of go from there. And it is a very useful measure, especially when you start looking into potential overtraining, or if just gauging your team on if athletes are starting to get run down and you're just trying to get a pulse of the team. It can also potentially pick up other forms of other stressors that, if we have objective data, we're getting exactly what they're doing on the field, but a perceived exertion might be higher if someone's getting less sleep, They might be getting less sleep because they're studying for an exam, or they have this stress going on, or a certain other stress. So it can potentially encapsulate more than just the objective measures alone. The drawback is you have to then ask, like for me right now, would having to ask 97 people every day, and as one person, I just don't do that. Now, how you could make that a number that you could use. So what you do is you have a session, and you can use whatever scale you want. I have up here a modified CR10, which was done in a research paper by Foster. You can use a Borg scale. It's just, all that matters is that you're consistent on your rating scale, and that if one's changed, like this modified CR10, if you have one that has a big jump in intensity, so going from 5 to 7 and there's no 6, or 7 to 10, just knowing that that may be reflected in some of your numbers. So you have a session, you report, that was a 7 out of 10 for me. That was a really hard session. With the session rating of perceived exertion, or SRPE, you would then multiply that number, that 7, by the total minutes of the activity. So say it was a 2-hour activity, that would give you essentially a score of 840 for the activity. Now, the fun part with this, and in measuring it in particular with football, is we can gain all of these pieces of information to truly quantify what it means to play the sport. So what are the movement patterns, contacts, jumps, throws, speeds, accelerations? I mean, there's really over 300 plus metrics that we can gain from this one device, which really comes in handy in all of our planning. So for example, in stating again, what are the game demands that we need to train for? Here's an example of safeties. What you'll have here in the green box on your lower left is the number of times they run over certain speeds. In this case, 12 miles an hour, 14, 16, 18. What's the average distance of each one of those reps? What's the maximum distance covered in a rep? And then what's the total yardage for that game at those speeds? And it should note that if I run, say, 20 miles an hour in a rep, I will obviously have to have passed through each one of those bands. So it's not that you pull all these total yards together, and at the end of the activity, I've done over 1,000 yards of high speed running. I've really only covered 359 yards at 12 miles an hour or greater. It's just that of the 12 miles an hour, the 359, then 330 was done at 14, 263 of that was done at 16, and 123 of that was done greater than 16 or 18 plus. So that's really interesting for, say, strength conditioning, in terms of how do your conditioning runs match up to some of this. But then equally as interesting is the number of medium and hard accelerations, the number of medium and hard decelerations, and then the changes of direction, and how do your drills match up to meet those intensities. And this is just a couple of metrics that we can use. We can also look at a team summary. So how does that depend on per position? And then some of this is going to depend on how many players you have available. If you have high school athletes that are playing multiple ways, these numbers might be higher. If you have different teams that run different schemes, these numbers might be a little bit different. But in general, so this is our speed counts, looking at that same breakdown, but by position. And then again, average distance per speed per position. So in essence, when you're looking at this, if you go to the right and you look at, say, some of the bigger guys, the number of times that they need to really run fast is very, very minimal. In particular, offensive line frequently running fast as them running onto the field and then running down to the end zone to celebrate a touchdown. I mean, aside from that, they really don't need to run that fast in terms of high speed running. And that may affect the way you train. Again, different high schools, if you run the single wing or some wing T version like my alma mater does, then maybe those numbers change. But for us, this is this tends to be where a lot of our players fall. Another interesting piece is the game summary overall. So I know this is a lot. If I take you one by one from left to right, you have average player load, which is the number given like in the session RPE, like that 840, but it's derived from the accelerometer in the wearable device. So that's a number basically referring to volume of activity. So what you have here is on defense, what's the average volume of activity? What's that average volume of activity per position, including special teams in the gray box? And then same thing with offense. So that gives you a picture of the whole game demand itself right there. Then you have drive metrics in the middle. So how many series are there in a game? How long is an actual series in real time? What's the longest number or the most number of drives we've had in a game? And then what's that longest period of time? And usually your longest stretches of time in a drive in a football game in particular, which is useful, is it's generally a scoring drive, but it also involves perhaps timeouts for quarters and, for our instance, like timeouts for media and some of that. So again, some of this may change and may be condensed for high school athletes, but I go with real time instead of game time because of that exact reason, because this is important in terms of rest and recovery. So the other box here on the far right is then essentially what is that volume of activity per minute. So you take your across looking at your cornerbacks, 240 of the average player load based on the amount of game time that they actually play, and they're accumulating at a rate. This is like how the speed of your car, they're accumulating at a rate of 4.7 player load per minute. So that's the rate of activity. If, for example, I had you run one rep from the goal line to the far goal line on the football field, you'd probably be close to 15 player load, which if you did that once in about 15 seconds, you would have a player load per minute of, say, 60. So obviously this will take into account just the rate of activity and not necessarily the total volume. Like if you did it once, it's not necessarily going to be that big of a deal, though the rate number looks really high. And then also what's the most intense, and I had it for us for over 3 minutes. So what do we really need to train for in terms of the peak demands of the sport? So cut off here a little bit, try to blow it up as big as I can for you. But one of the things we did, say from a strength conditioning standpoint, is look at our numbers and then reflect on how those numbers compare to what the first week of camp was going to look like. One of the things for us at the college level is you're restricted in the amount of hours you have in a week in the summer. And then those restrictions seem to go away in camp. And that's a very steep ramp up of activity. So what we're trying to meet is the hardest demands of practice. So maybe not necessarily the volume, but what are those sprints over certain speeds? What are those distances covered? What are those changes of directions? Reflect on that from our summer conditioning to a certain point, and then make modifications for the second half of summer to help make sure our guys are prepared to meet those demands for camp. Now, return to performance. Maybe something a little more interesting for this cohort as well is, say something were to happen to an athlete and get injured. Basically, it's how do we get them back to where they were before? So on the left side, we had an athlete get injured in week 2 of the season, missed some time, but instead of just throwing them right back in, one, we can monitor how they're performing in rehab sessions and field-based return and progress them up in speeds and volumes and that sort, so that they don't just get kind of put back into practice. But then when they do go into practice, how do we modify how much they do and how hard they do it so that they can get back to their pre-injured levels without ramping up too quickly? And it's kind of a tricky balancing act. Depends on the injury. Obviously depends on everything you tell me in terms of what the athlete's rehab looks like. I'm really just sort of the feeder of info in this regard, and how we get them going again, and then how the athlete feels. A lot of times I see things like this. So in terms of ramping up volume, but then also in terms of change of direction here, as you see an increase in their ability to cut again, this is really good feedback for the athlete in terms of um, confidence that they can meet the demands that they were required to meet before they were injured. So that's one way we can use this in return to performance. And then another way is if, in this case, a certain athlete had an upper body injury, how do we train them so that they can get fresher, but in this instance, actually get faster from the point they got injured to then the point on the far right where they returned. And so this is in miles per hour. How do we help them be at their peak going into bowl practice and bowl prep? So a couple different ways we can use it. A couple different additional resources for you. So there's a paper here on tracking systems that just came out by Lorena Torres Ronda, as well as the NSCA's Essentials of Sports Science book, which came out last fall, which is really, really good. Really gives a broad overview, not just in sorts of this aspect of it, but also in some weight room based technology, some force plate technology, some general practice and principles. So they did a really nice job in terms of getting this textbook up and running. And then another paper. But so just a couple thoughts for high school athletes. If you have athletes that have Apple Watches or some sort of GPS watch, you can have them potentially wear them in their sport and get an idea of, the total distance covered, potentially maybe a speed covered as well. And you can start to identify some of the demands at that level, to then help you design and progress your programming, or really, in this instance, perhaps your return to play. So with that, I will stop sharing. There's my email. Again, happy to answer any and all questions. You want to set up separate calls with me. But that's my email at the bottom there. Happy to talk anytime, and let's do some questions.
Phil, thanks very much for the presentation. That was excellent. I thought it was really well designed and applicable to what people are actually interested in. So I can read the questions to you, because I think that's always easier than trying to read and answer at the same time. So one of our athletic training students in our graduate program has asked that, how often do you meet with athletic trainers to discuss athletes' conditioning prior to injury? And what are the nature of those conversations? Kind of what information is going back and forth? How do you try to frame the information that you're providing to the medical team?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I don't know if any of them happen to be on the call, but I tend to just make myself available around there all the time, going through and having those conversations, not just for talking about potential specific injuries and cases and whatnot, but just building rapport, building relationship, and just being a part of a team. But whenever they come up, I have different spreadsheets that I have. So of those numbers, I'll dial into a potential one person's history of activity up into their injury. And then based on, what Brett says, or Jensen or Lionel, it'll be like, hey, this week we want him to go at 50%, to a certain point, you might be like, all right, well, 50% of what? So here we have, all right, here's different metrics that we think we want them to hit. Maybe it's this volume. Maybe we don't want him running over 12 or 14 or 18 miles an hour. And in some of these instances, these technologies let us track that live, and we can go over and pump the brakes on somebody, or push them a little bit more. But it really helps kind of smooth the path of return. And we'll do that daily, a couple of times a day. So I talk to them more about the injury piece, perhaps, and I even do the coaches in terms of how you structure practice and all that kind of stuff. And with that said, again, like really one of the best pieces that I've had come out of this is showing those return to play athletes, here's where you were, here's your progression back, and here's where you're at now, and you can do it now. And it helps with that mindset that trust that they have in returning.
That's great. So waiting for other questions to come in. Please, if you've got them, add them to the question and answer and to the chat. The question I've gotten, it's a bit of a cheat because I was on your dissertation committee and we've sort of talked about this quite a bit, but I'm wondering, when you look at papers or blogs or other stuff that comes out around monitoring workload with wearable technology, there's often discussion of like really complex modeling that happens, right? Like people are doing really fancy statistics and trying to work with engineers to like figure out how to use this data. Can you just try to describe what the benefits of the basics are, RPE, heart rate, versus what are people trying to get at as they're doing these more complex modeling approaches?
Yeah, and I can see a lot of this in terms of being like, why do admissions departments ask for your SATs and like only your SATs? I think everyone's trying to find a quick, easy number that they can plug in that give them confidence in terms of doing this will increase the risk of injury, or doing this will speed up recovery. And just like SATs are a horrible predictor of student success, is that, there's so much more to it than that. The objective measures, like I said, is what they've done. And in particular, I should also note it's technically what the unit has done. So if they don't wear the unit correctly, or if there's an issue with fit or some of those things, your numbers are going to get thrown off. I had some issues with kickers kicking our local anchors in the indoor, and it throws some of the numbers off because now your local positioning system's messed up. But in using heart rate and session RPE, we can really get like I said, we can get a baseline more of how they actually feel, and then even pick up on some of the other stressors that we have going on that also tend to be cheaper than these wearable devices. No one's there yet. Part of the issue with being able to do or attempt to do some of these fancy modelings and predictions is, one, on the session RPE score, some people are some kind of their baseline EORs in a way. And so what some people end up looking at is not necessarily what number you report, but the change in that number. The other piece as well, sorry, one of my kids just ran by. The other piece as well is the fact that you're looking at the objective measures, and that the rate of injury is so low compared to the number of athletes you're observing and whatnot, that you end up having issues with the data. So you're really trying to look back and make assumptions that might not necessarily be true about the future. But the nice part with this stuff and this data is that it is so new, and the technology is always developing, that maybe we can put some heads together and get the kin department a quantum computer and do something crazy.
And I think what'll end up being the last question for you here is our just absolutely amazing, best athletic trainer that I've worked with, men's soccer athletic trainer, a terrible bowler though, really bad, but good at athletic training. He wanted to know, do you hit a point where there's too much information? So you put accelerometers on athletes, you've got them also wearing heart rate monitors or bibs, and you're also doing some video-based analysis, and all these information points are kind of flowing in, and you either don't know what to do with the data, or you have so much data that's competing with each other. How do you sort of manage the flow in a way that actually helps and doesn't lead to confusion?
Yeah, or paralysis by analysis, and picking out the certain metrics you want to tell your narrative. It's a challenge, right? So there's a lot of things that go into it: budget, help, how much influence you actually do have. Like, why would you collect all these pieces of information if you don't really have an amazing coach like Mel Tucker or Damon Rensing to throw them by, that'll listen to you and give you the credit or the opportunity. Yeah, and so I really try and keep more of it basic. So for us, at least, like I said, there's over 300 plus metrics that you can easily get lost in on some of these devices. Is really what's the total amount of activity, what was our cutting like, how many times do we do something sort of physically intense? And then everyone's the top speed's like a 40-yard dash time for people that in times really doesn't matter. But everyone wants to know it, and really just kind of go from that. And really when you dial down to it, you can almost just go off of volume, because if all you're doing is comparing football to football and football movements to football, then that total volume would in theory encapsulate a lot of what you're looking for. The other stuff ends up being a bit more program design based. So if we have a hard part of practice after a hard part of practice after a hard part of practice, are we getting, and this is kind of to the coach's end, are we getting the quality of activity that they are looking for? And if the answer is no, it might be because we've stacked all these hard periods together, when in fact in football you have 4 hard minutes and then you sit for 15. But in terms of answering your question, in terms of like, how do you know when you have too much? And I'm trying to right now is, if I can manage the data and some people listen, I'll try and collect a bunch, because then really smart people like you can help me figure out what's good, and then I'll throw the rest away later.
Well, thanks, Bill. We really appreciate you taking the time and dodging some kids along the way. Really appreciate that. I'm sure everyone enjoyed the talk. With that, please go be a dad. That's exciting. And I'll pass it over to Tracy to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, everybody.
I'd like to also thank you, Billy. That was a great talk. Thank you.
No, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night. Our next speaker is Dr. Alex Lempke. Dr. Lempke received her Bachelor's of Science degree in athletic training from the University of Pittsburgh in 2016. She then went and completed her Master's of Education in Kinesiology with a focus on athletic training from the University of Virginia in 2017, where she was also a graduate assistant athletic trainer for women's field hockey team. And she completed her thesis project on gait biomechanics and lower extremity injury. She recently completed her PhD at the University of Virginia in sports medicine in 2021 with her dissertation titled Wearable Sensors for Infield Running Gait Analysis and Interventions. Alex began a postdoctoral research fellowship at McKinley Center for Sports Injury Prevention through Boston Children's Hospital this past fall. Her current research interests include quantifying gait biomechanics using wearable technology for youth runners, exploring running-related injury risk factors, and approaches to injury prevention. I'd like to thank Dr. Lempke for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you to present.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you for the opportunity to present this evening. And thank you all for your attention and for tuning in and staying on for the call. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, perfect. So the purpose of my talk today is going to be to discuss the use of wearable sensors in running medicine. And similar disclaimers to Bill, I'm not really endorsing the use of a particular sensor. I'm really just going to speak to a sensor that I've had experience with and have validated in my lab. But I want to talk about the broader concepts about why wearable technology is important, particularly from a running related injury standpoint. So going to kind of start broadly about why it's important and then funnel into some of the applications that I've done from a research standpoint, and then really tie that into how we can apply that for clinical practice. You can also feel free to ask any questions. My email address is listed, and please feel free to reach out to me if anything comes up kind of moving forward if you have more questions. Okay, so pretty much I'm going to start with a really broad lens here, right? Running related injuries are a huge problem among runners. About half of them will actually develop running related injuries within a 12-month span of participation. And there's close to 108 million runners across 70,000 events. Obviously, this has changed a little bit because of COVID, but people are still getting out and choosing to run on their free time. So when we're thinking about running related injury, I've adapted this model from Bertelsen and colleagues in 2017. But you can kind of think about 3 major facets that are feeding into an individual's ability to handle or withstand load that's imposed on their body during bouts of movement. And when this load capacity is exceeded, that's when we're starting to see these running related injuries occur. So kind of broadly, we can think about personal attributes. So think about this on the individual level, kind of what they're bringing to the table. You can also think about the training attributes, kind of what's imposed on the individual in their running environment, whether that's from a coach or what they opt to do in their training schedule. And then finally, what I'm going to be discussing this evening are the running attributes and the biomechanics. So thinking about the way that an individual moves as they're running and going through their training. So hopefully this looks like a little bit of review. I always like to err on the side of too much information when thinking about running biomechanics. But really broadly, you can break down the running gait cycle from 0 to 100% of gait, starting with that initial foot contact on the ground, whether that's the heel, the forefoot, or the midfoot. As soon as that foot hits the ground, we're moving into a stance phase, where the goal is to propel the runner forward and move forward to the swing phase for that forward progression. So in order to move smoothly through the running gait cycle, we need to employ biomechanics, whether we're doing this subconsciously or if we're very aware of what's going on. But there's really concerted movement patterns that are occurring to help an individual successfully move through a gait pattern. So we can break this down into several major categories. There are obviously more measures that you can look at when thinking about running biomechanics, but kind of the main ones that come up in research, but also from a clinical lens, or what's important to look at for our runners include the kinematics, which is kind of a fancy way of saying the joint angles. The kinetics, which is thinking about the load that's going through the body. So this is a sample of a ground reaction force curve that's apparent in running. So we have the loading rate, or the rate of forces that are coming through the foot and through the leg and ultimately the body, with an impact peak, or that kind of that peak load that's imposed. Finally, we have the ground reaction force, kind of that weight acceptance, moving through to propulsion. So our body kind of immediately slows us down as our foot hits the ground, and then we can propel forward. And then finally, we have spatiotemporal outcomes, which if you break that word apart, we have both elements of space and time. So thinking about things like pace, cadence, really anything that's kind of helping us to move forward through the gait cycle. So I'll hit a little bit harder on each of these different metrics when we think more specifically about wearables and how we can measure these for our runners. So I want to get to why wearable technology is really important from a running centered standpoint. So Bill did a really nice job thinking about it from kind of a football based and performance based standpoint, but why does this matter for our runners? So the majority of assessments to date that from research studies and then just in general, our gait assessments have really focused on analyses in the laboratory and on treadmills. And we know that from a clinical context that this doesn't offer us a whole ton of options, right? A lot of us don't have kind of fancy equipment sitting around in our clinical setting and may have to outsource to specialists who can operate the equipment. And really, when we're even using the laboratory assessments, even though it's our gold standard, we know that what it's measuring is accurate. We're only getting a couple of hundreds worth of steps in our assessment, which really might not be representative of what an individual is actually doing when they're going out for their natural bouts of running. Pardon my clip art, but on treadmills, we also know that it's kind of a standard set speed when we're on a treadmill, and that might not represent kind of the natural variability that we have when we're doing things like going out for a trail run or running in a marathon, where there's a whole lot happening and we're not in this controlled environment any longer. So really, we can think about a lot of different factors that are feeding into an individual's running biomechanics. We have things like climate, elevation, intensity and speed, incline, surface. All these things are feeding into the way that a runner is moving and might ultimately influence their biomechanics. So that's why it's really important to try to measure them in their natural running setting so we can get a more representative sample of what's actually going on. Another kind of facet of this from a clinical context is thinking about patient-centered care, right? If any of you have ever worked with runners before or a runner yourself, you might have heard things like this either in your own internal kind of conversation or with a conversation with an athlete, right? My foot pain starts around mile 6 of my run. They're not really feeling it for the first portion of their run, but they really start to feel it later on when maybe they're fatigued and things are starting to change in their movement patterns. Or I'm really only feeling my knee when I'm running downhill. super hard to recreate in a lab setting or on a treadmill in general. And then finally, my hip was bothering me more when I run on concrete, right? So there's these effects of potentially speed, fatigue, surface, everything that could be feeding into a running related injury model that we're not effectively capturing in a lab setting that really might be influencing patients' pain cycles. So super important to think about incorporating wearable technology for these reasons. So some of the benefits of leveraging technology, I've kind of already hit on these, but just to drive it home. For the most part, wearables for running specific measurements are fairly inexpensive and user-friendly. So it doesn't require that outsourcing to specialized clinics or the huge clunky motion capture assessment tools. We can also get up to 15,000 steps of running in a day, and that's in their natural running setting for our runners. And this doesn't require us to run alongside them, right? We have some indirect supervision. If we can throw wearables on our runners, have them go off on their run, and then return, we get a lot of really rich data from that standpoint. So there are a ton of wearables that are commercially available, and there's also laboratory grade wearables that are options for measuring runners. I'm going to speak specifically about ones that I've used before, which are RunScribe sensors. But really, when you're thinking about what wearables you might want to incorporate with athletes, it's important to think about what metrics they offer. Where the sensors are located on the body to make sure they're actually measuring what you're interested in and are going to be accurate. And also, are they valid against kind of our gold standard equipment, right? So I've worked a lot with the RunScribe sensors to validate against the lab equipment that we had, and they were found to be fairly valid. That's why I'm going to speak towards those, just because we can kind of hang our hat on the metrics and trust that what they're actually giving us is fairly representative of what they did in the lab. So again, there's 400 plus commercially available wearables, so that can be a little bit overwhelming from a clinical standpoint, but it's important to note that the majority of them are accelerometry based, just like Bill mentioned. So again, important considerations: is the device valid? Can it measure what you want to observe? And then, do the outcomes make sense? I think that's one of the most important things to think about, because a lot of times proprietary companies have kind of black box algorithms where they're providing you with this brand new measure that can predict injury and tell you everything you could ever want to know, but they don't actually tell you how it's measured. So make sure that you're kind of able to understand what it's giving you so you can relay that to your athletes appropriately as well. Okay, so for the RunScribe specifically, these are triaxial accelerometers, gyroscopes, and magnetometers, so that we can get pretty good solid measures of running biomechanics. As you can see, they're located on runners' laces of their shoes. So we're getting really close to the point of interest on the feet, given that's where the running turnover happens, right? So sampling rate, again, some of these technical aspects are not as important to kind of dwell on as much, but the important thing is that we validated these against gold standard, and they can actually provide a lot of important biomechanical measures that are of interest when thinking about a running cycle. What's also nice is that athletes can connect to the RunScribe application on their phone. So the sensors are linked to an account so they can see kind of what they're doing. And also from a research standpoint, we can get that data back. From a clinical standpoint, we also get PDFs of data, which is nice to see. And you can measure everything step by step yourself as well. So this is just an example of the platform. So you can see that we get information on where athletes are landing on their foot, as well as how much pronation they have or how much their foot's turning over while they're running. And this is just a sample run that I took, but you can see that we're getting huge amounts of mileage, a long time, good battery life, which is essential for looking at distance runners, especially. So getting to the nitty gritty a little bit more about what we can actually measure. Again, these are examples specifically from the sensors that I've used in the past, but these are also really important metrics, kind of like what I spoke about before. So these should hopefully look somewhat familiar, but we're getting good spatiotemporal measures, loading metrics, as well as kinematic measures. So again, thinking about joint angles, this one specifically to the foot and ankle with pronation, velocity, and excursion. So again, the description of the outcome is on the right here. We're also getting loading based metrics. So the run scribe provides a shock metric, which is kind of a composite score looking at the ground reaction force, a combination of impact, or that vertical component of loading, and braking, that horizontal component where the body's kind of getting slowed down from that foot contact. We're also able to get spatiotemporal measures like cadence, or the rate of the feet turning over during running, the contact time, which is the length of time that the foot is on the ground for during the stance cycle, and stride length, or the distance between two successive foot placements of the same foot. So all of these are really important to think about from a biomechanical standpoint. Again, if you've assessed runners in the past, these hopefully look somewhat familiar, but the nice thing about the wearables is we can get each of these successive foot strike metrics for across the entire activity and over time. Okay, so getting to some of the data and some of the applied context from a clinical standpoint. So here's an example from a cross-country runner that I was working with here. So we took his elevation data from his run that he did over time. This was an example from a 15-mile run. And each of these little dots along this graphic here, these are the number of steps along the x-axis. And for an example here, I just took cadence, or their step rate. So you can see that each individual dot represents a step across that entire length of that run. So we got 22,000 steps, huge amounts of data, lots of fun to have as a clinician and a researcher. Okay, so getting into some of the clinical applications here, I wanted to focus on two major kind of components of assessment and intervention here with the wearable sensors. So there's been a lot of really great studies that have come out looking at some of these external factors and internal factors that I mentioned before when taking the whole person into account. So there's been past studies that have looked at the effect of running speed and running surface on biomechanics using wearables, the effects of fatigue during marathon length distances or even ultra marathon distances. We previously looked at the effects of workouts on running biomechanics, so kind of that speed work, sprint work, how that changes up how a runner runs. Additional races, 5 kilometers and lower for track athletes. But today I'm going to focus on the influence of injury, because I think from a clinical standpoint, this is where it becomes really interesting that we can actually measure and see what's going on to change a runner's biomechanics in the face of pain. And then from there, I'm going to touch a little bit on gait training interventions. So in the past, researchers have looked at the effects of taping and bracing, thinking about an ankle sprain standpoint and how that actually influences pronation velocity and excursion. But today I'm going to touch on a little bit of my dissertation work looking at the influence of injury and then what we did to actually provide an intervention based on the deficits we saw with the wearables. And I'm also going to present briefly some results from Rich Willey and colleagues in 2016 that found kind of similar outcomes with wearable technology. Okay, so we recently got this study published in the Journal of Biomechanics, but we used wearable sensors to identify biomechanical changes in runners that were actively experiencing leg pain. So just a little bit of background, lower limb injuries are a huge burden in the running community, and about 75% of shin splints are chronic cases, right? So there's a lot of kind of terminology tossed around, whether it's something you might have heard previously in your clinical training, or if you've read it in an article, but these can be called shin splints, medial tibial stress syndrome. I'm kind of using a catch-all term to capture all of this called exercise-related lower leg pain for the population that we were interested in looking at. But based on some indoor running assessments of our leg pain patients, it's been pretty consistently found that these runners have larger eversion and hip adduction changes in their kinematics. They also typically present with a rear foot strike pattern or landing on their heel. This is coinciding with higher amounts of loading, so large forces going through their body, maybe that they are kind of exceeding that load capacity like I talked about before. And we also found pretty slow cadence or a slow foot turnover that's maybe exposing them to increased load. But again, these are all indoor assessments done on treadmills and often done with individuals with risk factors and not necessarily shin splints themselves. So what does this look like when we get to their outdoor biomechanics? This is where I wanted to kind of delve in a little bit deeper. So what I did was I incorporated wearable sensors to assess a week's worth of biomechanical data among 32 runners with that leg pain. And then we looked at 32 healthy comparison runners. I'm not going to get too deep into the nitty gritty of the analyses that we ran on these individuals, but kind of like Chris mentioned with Bill as well, there are some kind of fancy techniques that we can do from a data wrangling standpoint, where we can do some fancy machine learning algorithms to see what features might be feeding into how they're changing. Just kind of a fancy way to say we're interested in seeing kind of what's emerging as something that's clinically meaningful among these runners when they're running compared to healthy individuals. What kind of biomechanical changes are maybe feeding into their pain and injury patterns that we can potentially address? So when we did a preliminary analysis, we essentially extracted all of the measurements that we could obtain from the sensors for each of their steps over the length of the entire data collection period. So oftentimes it's about 4 to 5 runs when individuals were collecting their own data by wearing those sensors. And what we found was, this doesn't really look like a whole lot, just an output from a program, but you can kind of notice that a lot of kind of similar things are emerging over time. So basically what this output is telling us is that significantly increased contact time for these runners with leg pain compared to healthy individuals on average. And this is really regardless of the length of time that we're assessing these steps. So across 10 steps, 50 steps, 5 steps, what's kind of re-emerging is that contact time is increased in these individuals. So perhaps from a more kind of like visually appealing standpoint, we can see that when we're comparing the contact time in milliseconds, so again, that's the length of time that the foot's on the ground, between our leg pain patients here on the left and our healthy individuals on the right. This curve here represents the number of steps that are taken within that contact time range. So we're seeing that our leg pain patients have a higher contact time than these healthy patients here across all their steps over time. So when we look at this from a statistical standpoint, we see that there's an 8 milliseconds increase in that leg pain group. And 8 milliseconds might not seem like a super long time, but for perspective, from a running standpoint, 8 milliseconds longer on the ground over a course of a 5-kilometer run or a 3-mile run is about 6,200 steps, meaning that they're spending almost a full minute longer on the ground compared to these healthy individuals, which over time might actually exacerbate their pain and lead to some of their long-term symptoms. What we also found that their contact time was highly dependent on pace bands. So when we're looking at kind of our faster runner group compared to our moderate pace running group and our slowest running group, we're finding that there's actually larger differences in our contact time at our fastest and our medium pace bands. So there's about an 8 milliseconds difference at our fastest, about 11 milliseconds at medium, and then about 2 milliseconds for our slowest group. Again, leg pain is in green, healthy is in orange here. So this really tells us that we need to individualize our approach to contact time assessment and intervention based on our patient, based on their speed that they're running, and what kind of activities they're opting to do outdoors. So just broadly, this was kind of the first study where we were actually able to use wearables in natural settings. And again, we found that this influence of pain led to increased and also more variable contact time across their runs. They had kind of a wider range of contact time over time. So this helped us inform a clinical intervention study and allowed for a foundation for more individualized care for our injured runners. So I'm going to lead into that next study here, where we took kind of what we found from this past study and applied it to see if we could actually do a gait training intervention for our injured runners. So this is kind of the second applied example. So from our initial study, again, we found that our runners had higher contact time compared to our healthy runners. So theoretically, if we tried to lower their ground contact time and reduce the amount of time spent on their feet during their stance phase of gait, our hypothesis was that we would actually be able to decrease their pain and symptoms and kind of return them to more of a healthy gait pattern. So we kind of developed this program where we could link up sensors to a regular wristwatch. specifically a Garmin. And we had a feedback program set up so that when the sensors were kind of telling the watch that their contact time based on a preliminary analysis exceeded a threshold that would potentially be harmful to their bodies, it would give them a little buzz on the wrist to decrease their contact time. So what this might look like is they're running, they receive a buzz, and then they're able to decrease their contact time to eliminate that stimulus. So the hope was to, again, reduce their contact time and improve their pain. So we compared this for a feedback program for runners with leg pain along with home exercises like we might prescribe for our patients in the clinic, and compared that to those that just had home exercises alone to see if there was a big difference in that intervention. Okay, so we had those two groups. So home exercise alone is our purple group here, and the feedback group is in white. And we compared their running at baseline, so before they received any kind of a feedback, compared to their outcomes at 4 weeks at the end of the intervention protocol. So what we found was that we were able to influence their running gait biomechanics from baseline and compared to the home exercise group alone for not only contact time, which was our primary outcome of interest, but also for their step rate or that cadence. So we were able to decrease contact time and increase cadence. If you remember, that was also a risk factor found during indoor running for these runners. So 2 birds with 1 stone, we found some pretty exciting outcomes from using wearables here. From more of a patient-centered standpoint, again, if we're able to change their running biomechanics, but aren't actually seeing any clinical improvements from a pain and function standpoint, it might not be that important. But we actually found that when we were looking at a visual analog scale for maximum pain, we found that this significantly decreased for our feedback group compared to home exercise and compared to the start of the study. And we also looked at their global rating of change from a -12 to a 12-point scale. And what we found was that our runners that had the feedback group had long-term improvements and had a 5-fold higher odds of reporting feeling a lot better or a great deal better compared to our home exercise group. So again, wearable sensors were pretty successful in not only changing the way that runners ran, but also improving their clinical outcomes. So finally, I wanted to draw this back to another study by Rich Willey and colleagues in 2016, where they used a Garmin-based wearable sensor linked with a Garmin wristwatch and did a similar study among runners with risk factors for stress fractures. And they found that kind of the similar programming focused on cadence this time, not only increased runners' cadence, but they also decreased their loading, decrease their hip biomechanics, and decrease the amount of work done at the knee. So they found immediate and long-term effects, but all this really speaks to the fact that the use of a pretty simple intervention without requiring a lot of clinical oversight led to really positive outcomes for injured runners. And that's potentially something that could be worked into a clinical program. So kind of just the key take homes, we can gain really unique information on runners' biomechanics as they relate to injury and recovery if we use wearables in the field. We can also use these to give our patients some feedback about what they're doing to improve their biomechanics and reduce their clinical symptoms. And finally, this is a cost-effective approach to patient assessment and intervention compared to some alternatives for clinical site. Sorry, I really love metaphors and also clip art. So as clinicians, we can use wearables to cast a wider assessment net, right? If we're running on a treadmill, we can only get a few steps in an artificial setting. But if we use wearables, we can get thousands of data points. We can get season-long assessments for athletes, potentially identify some risk factors for persistent problems during movement, again, like we found with the contact time. We can also track recovery if we're looking at outcomes over time and lower extremity injuries. So with wearable technology, there's the potential to kind of encompass a much more broad assessment and intervention net. And then finally, I do want to stress the fact that using wearable sensors doesn't necessarily remove clinical insights, right? This is just a toolbox or a tool in your toolbox to be able to use to give you a little bit more information about what's going on with our athletes when we're tracking things like injury, recovery, and overall wellness. So we can use them in clinical settings, right? We can put sensors on during indoor treadmill analyses if you want to actually eyeball what's going on with your patients and watch them run for a more objective assessment. But you can also use them outside of the clinical setting. And I think that's kind of the direction that we're moving in athletic training, is kind of meeting patients at their home turf, so to speak. So I hope this was helpful for you thinking about the use of wearables in running medicine. Hopefully you kind of saw a way that this can integrate into your clinical practice as an athletic trainer. And I'm really happy to answer any questions that you might have about this presentation or just in general about wearables for runners. Thank you so much.
Alex, thanks so much for your awesome presentation. I really appreciate that. As someone who's just starting to use RunScribes a little bit, this is really helpful in understanding what some of the capabilities are. So we've got a bunch of questions kind of flying in here. Mary Thiel, who's a physical therapist at our MSU affiliated physical therapy clinic, has 2 questions, and I'll read them to you because it's easier to do it this way, I think. Clinically, Mary's kind of wondering, just from a kind of tangible perspective, like, how do you work with patients around using these wearables? Like, do you loan them out? Do you ask them to purchase a pair? Like, how does it sort of work so that they can actually, wear them out in free living or, on the trail or where it is that they're actually doing their running?
Yeah, that's a great question. Historically, we have bought sensors ourselves and then loaned them out to patients. What's nice is, like, they don't have to be so specifically designed for a specific patient, right? It's not like we're tailoring a shirt size to our patient or something like this. They simply strap onto the shoes and you calibrate them to that patient, so they can take them for a week and then bring them back, and then you can use them for other patients kind of going forward as well. So what's nice is they're pretty user friendly. They were really like, the specific sensors that we used were designed to be commercially available for athletes who are interested in tracking their metrics. So it's a super easy interface. You can have individuals download apps onto their phones. If you're interested in looking at kind of proxy measures, if you're not interested as in depth from kind of like a research method standpoint, but you want to get some ideas about things like step rate or their pace and kind of how that changes over time, simple wristwatches can often work. And like, data sharing is becoming more popular as well, and making that more accessible between patients and clinicians. So even using things like watches or like Apple-based metrics of health can kind of share some of those data as well. So kind of a long-winded response, but hopefully that was helpful.
I think that was tremendously helpful. Absolutely. And then, so Mary's second question is, how do you sort of identify middle school and high school runners who are either at risk or that are willing or sort of up for engagement with this type of integration of wearables or interventions to help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the adolescent athlete monitoring is becoming more popular. There really hasn't been a lot done with adolescent athletes in the past, particularly from a running lens. So this is something that I'm kind of burgeoning into myself. But I find what's most helpful to get interest in the wearable technology is really giving back to the patients and showing them kind of what we can measure and why it matters. So anytime that we can give kind of information back about what that looks like, why it matters to our patients, I think that we can get a lot more buy-in, which is really helpful. And even just generating kind of basic reports from the wearable sensors that we get can be pretty helpful. It's also kind of like a popularity thing. It's like, oh, I have these cool sensors on my shoes. I wonder what other people are wearing, and can I get them too, and kind of what we can do with those. From a movement standpoint, I again think that in terms of risk factors, we're still just at the very beginning stages of measuring and assessing this. So since adolescents are really in developmental stages and they're growing into their bodies and figuring out how to optimize movement, it's going to look a lot different from what we found historically in our adult patients. So it's definitely something that we're trying to gain a lot of data on so that we can get more information about what are potential areas of intervention for adolescent athletes.
Great. So Michelle, who's one of the doctoral students who is a contributor to our lab and is an all-star, has asked a good question. She's a doctor of physical therapy, an exercise physiologist, and a doctoral student. So she's coming from a few different lenses. And she's wondering about, if you were to prescribe some intervention, right, to try to change right-left symmetry or to decrease contact time or whatever it may be, and patients are initially reporting a decrease in their pain, it seems, or discomfort, or whatever variable you're using to indicate success. Are there concerns about the potential for causing pain in a different area, or potentially adding tissue stress that maybe the patient's not used to, that could cause an issue for them in the long term?
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think with all interventions, it has to be extremely gradual, right? So when we're thinking about running biomechanics, I always like to think of like, how did you learn how to run, right? You never actually received formal training in doing so. Your body just integrated a pattern that felt natural to itself. Sometimes it's advantageous. You are pretty efficient in your movement patterns, and sometimes it's a little bit off kilter. But I think anytime we're trying to make those changes, since they are such ingrained movement patterns, we have to do so very, very gradually so that we don't displace their pain and cause issues elsewhere. So in the 2 example studies that I showed of the gait training, the changes were only 5%. So that seems like very, very small, but when we're thinking about the difference between the contact time in healthy versus injured, again, we only saw an 8 milliseconds different. So it's not like we're trying to kind of drastically change gait patterns. It should be very, very slow and gradual. And I also think it's super important from a clinical context, especially with physical therapy and an athletic training lens, incorporating things like strengthening to make sure we're not kind of displacing load or other forces to kind of the weakest link area is super important. So like the interventions that I showed before, home exercise was always incorporated. So just making sure we're taking the whole person into account. And I think slow going is the best way.
Great. So Alec, really thank you so much for this presentation and for introducing people to some different wearable technologies that have been integrated in different areas outside of field sports, potentially. And so with that, yeah, thanks for your presentation, and I'll pass it over to Tracy so that she can introduce our next speaker.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Alex, so much. That was a great presentation. So our next speaker is Coach Damon Rensing. Coach Rensing was a former MSU soccer standout, and he has become the 5th head coach in Spartan history, where he became head coach in 2009. Coach Rensing just completed his 13th season as head coach, compiling an impressive record of 130 wins, 94 losses, and 35 ties. In his first 11 years as the head coach, the Spartans made the 8 NCAA tournaments, including a run to Spartans' first College Cup in 50 years in 2018. Under Coach Rensing's leadership, the Spartans have received 29 All Big Ten and 19 NSCAA All-Region selections, in addition to 9 players that were named to the Big Ten All-Tournament team. The Spartans' performance in the classroom during Coach Rensing's tenure has been equally impressive. Over the last 12 years, MSU has received 111 academic All-Big Ten selections and 47 Big Ten Distinguished Scholars selections. I'd like to just thank Coach Rensing for speaking to us tonight, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, the only close I'll get to the doctor status is my initials. So yeah, but I appreciate you guys having me on, and I also want to echo my gratitude to all the athletic trainers out there, and congratulate you guys on your athletic training month, what you guys have done over the last couple years. I don't think gatekeeper and contact tracer and all those other things were in the job description, but you guys have been awesome, and we're very fortunate to have all of you guys. So sorry about that. So I'll kind of get going here. I will just make one full disclosure. I'm used to talking in the locker room, so that's my comfort zone. If I was wearing a wearable right now, my heart rate would probably be at max level, even though my GPS would not really cover very much ground. But what I'd like to do is just kind of talk about how we apply this information that we get as coaches and how we use it. I think, when I started to play at Michigan State, we did 2-a-days every day for 7 straight days without a day off. I think also as a student athlete back then, we also just didn't even ask questions why. We just did it. Well, coach said to do it. And I think times have obviously changed. And, now that we have some science that can help us with this, but also I think a lot of the kids these days, if you ask them that, hey, we're going to do 2-a-days for every day for 7 days, they're going to ask, why is that good for me? And so what the wearables do, I think, is provide me some information and some reasoning to give them to back up why we're doing things, give them that answer why, and also kind of it really helps me do a lot of things that I'll get into here. One even being manage culture, because now that we have the science to back up some of these decisions we make as coaches, and it's certainly, while it's an exact science as far as how it's seen or used or collected, it's not an exact science as far as how it's applied, because at the end of the day, we do have to try to win games. But in order to do that, we have to be, healthy. And so that what this does, I think early on, without this information, I think we were pretty reactive. So we would react to overtraining, and we'd only notice it because we would get hamstring or injuries, hamstring, groin, or guys were just well over sore. And so now the idea is to be proactive with this information and preventative. And the more that we can keep our kids on the field, on the court, the better we're going to be as coaches and as teams. So that's where I think this stuff really, really comes in. I can talk a little bit too. Nowadays, we use a lot more of the training load information and accelerated runs. But when I started out, we really focused on heart rate too. So for some of the high school trainers that maybe just have, an Apple Watch that they use, we would use it just kind of start out with some heart rate, and so I can talk a little bit about that. As far as that goes, I said, why do we gather it? I think initially maybe coaches would think, hey, I can prove that they're not working hard enough, right? Like, oh, I can tell them they didn't do enough sprints, or their heart rate never got high enough, when actually, especially at our level, all these kids work pretty darn hard. It's really more about the recovery of it, and overtraining. So that's where we would start to use those heart rates. So even initially, maybe 8 to 10 years ago, when we started to use this, I think soccer is pretty cutting edge, especially in Europe. I think we started to really get involved with this as soon as most sports. What we would want to do is we could see after a game, if a guy played a lot of minutes, if we started to train and warm up, and if his heart rate would kind of spike right away, then we could tell he wasn't recovered. And so then we could make adjustments, whether it's hold him out of practice for the day, or limit his training sessions, or just only do half the drills. There's a lot of different things that we could apply when we see those heart rates. Also, obviously, what we would do as well is when we would build fitness, back then we would give them, they would want you to have your heart rate to come down to about 65% of your max. So if we were going to run, a 400 for fitness, which we would run on like Monday mornings at 6 a.m. in the winter. So we would start to divide them into groups based on their fitness. And then we would run them. They would have the same times that they would have to complete it. But if one person, say, or a group of guys would need 90 seconds to get down to 65% of their max heart rate before we ran them again, and someone else might need 2 minutes. So we would give them that time, and then hope that as we did that, we could get the maximum output from them. And then those gaps would shorten. So the guys that were needed 2 minutes to recover, hopefully over a period of time, we would build that fitness, and they would only need, say, 105 seconds to closer to 90 seconds. So I think that's really, really important. So we could also then, as it started to advance and we've gotten past heart rates, we've obviously still use it, but we really start to look at accelerated runs, training loads, and I'll get into a little bit more as far as the numbers and what we do, but we use that for probably a couple things. In game, we have the live technology. So prime example, we did an exhibition our second day of preseason, and we had a kid score a couple goals. We had John Hamill, who is our sports science guy, who does a great job and helped me with this a little bit. We were supposed to play him about 45 minutes, and he already scored a couple goals. We pulled up the numbers, and we saw that he hit his accelerated run load. And instead of playing the full 45, we got what we needed out of him, and we said sub him out, because it was an exhibition and it wasn't really anything dire, and we got what we need out of it, and we were able to preserve him, and he got what he needed and we got what we needed out of it. So that was really good. And then obviously after the post game, we can do that. We'll look at some stuff too, look at the numbers, see what their output was, what their training load was. And then we also have to look at it over a season and start to make some things. So one of the tough things I think for coaches is, we're always going micro, macro, back to micro to macro. So what do I mean by that? My goal is on Sunday is I got to win this game. So, when we're up against Michigan in the fall, not if, when we're up against Michigan in the fall with, 2-1 with 15 minutes left, when say somebody's really kind of hit a pretty good load, if I feel like him at 80% is going to help us win the game, I'm not going to just hit a number and then say, hey, we got to sub him out. So in that micro moment, I've got to play to win that game. And then when I step back and try to look at it from a macro, what I do know is he really had a strong output. So how can I now help him recover through the week with his training load, or minimize minutes maybe in a different game? What I do know is if I continue to overplay him game in, game out, then he probably will have injuries. So I have to kind of start to pick and choose within that micro moment, and then also step back and think of some things macro as far as how that looks for the whole season. Who do we really focus on with all this information? To be honest, it's kind of a bell curve. And the ones that are in the middle, we don't, they're doing pretty well. It's really the ones that are either unfit and injured on that side of the bell curve, or the ones that are really high end, really their output is really high end. Guys that are your all-stars who are always playing, hardly coming out, the wear and tear on those guys. So we really try to focus on those two ends. And obviously we kind of know where those guys settle in the middle. And I think sometimes, we get questions from the players like, why are we wearing these things? And we usually tell them, hey, if you're kind of not hearing from us or talking to us about it, then you're probably in a good spot. But I'll have conversations and let them know to a certain degree. But mainly it's for us coaches, our athletic trainers, our strength coaches, for us to take this information and then maybe disseminate a little bit of it. What I tell our players is, you guys don't gauge. That's our job. We'll limit the training sessions throughout the week, but you need to come and give every drill maximum effort. And then it's up to us, to me, Vince Del Valle, our trainer, who does an awesome job, John Hamill, and my staff, to outline a good week that prevents them from getting injured and has them ready to perform during games at their peak. So that's what we try to tell those players. What else does is it allows us to kind of see what drills. So there's, what does this information allow me to do? One, it kind of confirms my feel or eye test and the players, so I'm seeing a guy that looks tired. It looks like he's not recovered. I can now look at that information, whether it's in game or in practice or over a week, and see, and then also like individually. So we had a kid a while back when we were using the heart rate, who he would recover. He was unbelievably fit and gifted. His heart rate would get up, but it would just convert right back down to a resting heart rate really, really quick. And he was a freshman. I mean, he was kind of a freak when it came to that stuff. However, as the season went on, we saw that his recovery was slowing down, and the season was kind of wearing on him. So I could actually show him that information, talk to him about it, and get an approach and say, hey, we're going to maybe not play in 90 minutes these games. We want the best 75 minutes we get out of you. And hopefully when we get to the NCAA tournament, now you'll be really in good form again. And so I think that was really helpful for us to explain to him why we're only playing him 75 minutes. It also allows me to rest and work players. The wearable technology is to rest and work players and give the reasoning behind it. So what I mean by that is those guys, back in the day, if you didn't have this information, your star players are playing all the time. So if I'm sitting them out of drills, trying to manage culture and tell the other players, like, why is he sitting out? Oh, you just like him, or he's the star, right? You just don't, he can do whatever he wants. No, the answer now is, well, he ran 7.5 miles a game. He had 50 accelerated runs, and his training load is close to 2,800 this week. So he needs to do less. And I think the guys that didn't play, so when you look at, say for us in soccer, we play, a couple days a week. So normally a full training load for a guy that plays a strong portion of the game would be probably between 1,000 and 1,200 units. So if you don't play, you're out, about anywhere from 1,200 to 1,400 units, because they do get a little bit in the warm up, in the pregame warm up. But so how do we make up that distance, make up that workload? So on the days after games, now the guys that don't play have to train harder. And I think for a while that would be perceived as punishment. But it's not. What it is, it allows us to rationalize with those players and motivate them and say, hey, look, here's the deal. We need you to do this workload so you can stay fit. So when there's an injury or a starter is not performing, you're now in a position where you can help yourself and help your team to the best of your abilities because you are fit, or you've maintained a good workload. So those are kind of the things that allow us to do that. And then lastly, it just opens good lines of communication. So you start to know players. I think Dr. Burghardt said it too, like, some guys, just if you ask them, was that practice a 7 or out of, what was it, 1 out of 10? They'd say, some guys are always going to say it's harder. Some guys are going to say it's easier. And that you can see those patterns and see how each individual kind of operates. And so when they're off one way or the other, I think it allows us to have some conversations. And with these, with the heart rates and with the training loads, I think there's variables. There's hydration, there's sleep, there's weather. We're an outdoor sport. There's heat. So it allows me now to have conversations when the scientists tell me that somebody's just not at their best, both physically, and you can start to see it mentally. It allows me to go over there and start to have conversations with the player. And what you end up finding out is I had 3 exams this week. I only got a couple hours of sleep. I was drinking a lot of coffee, those types of things. So then we can say, well, are you hydrated enough? You make sure you get some sleep. Can you find ways to nap during the day, or do whatever you can to make sure, you can get back to your best. So that's something that's great. So what we'll do, and Chris, if you don't mind sharing the screen here, I'll kind of show you what we do. And so normally when we start in a playing week, when we have a game, when we're really kind of going, we're looking for about 2,800 units per week. And like I said, you got to give them 1 day off. So you've got 6 days. If 2 of those games are between about 1,000, you've got about 800 units within the next 4 days that you've got to kind of put together. And so, sorry, Chris, is that possible, or Tracy, to share the screen? Perfect. Thank you so much. They had to do it because I am very technologically unsavvy. So, so this is kind of this is actually, we came back in January, and so we're actually playing a game in 2 days which would be right at the end of, I believe, week 7 here. And so this will kind of show you. So we came back. The first thing we did was we ran the yo-yo intermittent test, which I think is great. And we only had them, it's just an assessment. We don't tell them to go max out. We just want to tell them to get to about 80% of what they can do. It's not like run till you drop or anything along those lines. Even the guys that could run, like, if you're familiar with the score, like our top guy ran like a 21.3 right out of break, Christmas break, which is pretty good. What we didn't even have them do that. We only had them go to about 19.1 just because they're just coming back. We didn't want to get into injuries. But what I do think that does allow us is to set the standard of where our guys are at and where our training loads can go. So we started out with week 1. Our goal was about 1650 for the week in training loads. So the beep test was a pretty decent one on the front end there. And so when you come off that, a lot of times those first days, so you can kind of work backwards. So we would go Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, off Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, off Saturday in the off season. And Sunday was just kind of our fitness day. So we'd have a pretty good day of fitness on Sunday. And then Mondays were always a little bit lower, as you could see. But Thursdays would start to simulate our games. And we wanted to work up to about 1,200 or 80% of that all the way up to week 6, which is, between 1,000 and 1,200, which was, on week 6, Thursday, you can see was our highest output. So originally we knew the guys would be fired up. So we'd have a good week the first week. And then we would kind of de-escalate or kind of slow it down a little bit on week 2. And then week 3, we would try to go from, it was 1650, I think, on week 1, maybe 1550 week 2. Then we would try to get to about 1800 week 3, drop a little bit down to 1750, 1700, and then really start to work up week 5. On Thursday, we played at about 60%. So that we had a game that got to about 60, or the practice was about 60% of our output of a game. Week 6 was 70%. And then week 7 is 80%. And then hopefully that gets them into practice. So what we would do is we'd work off of that Thursday. So if you knew that you were going to try to get 800 units on Thursday or 700, whatever that number was, we could then start to set some things up. And as you get training sessions, and we also ask the players to get their ratings of what they thought the difficulty is. But as you start to get these training loads, you can start to see which practices and drills work. So we break it all, even the drill up. We know, like, our warm up is 110 units of our practice, and then each drill we can kind of start to see how that works, and it really allows us to put a full week of training and really starts to help us kind of manage. And really we've been pretty, knock on wood. I mean, maybe it's just because I have the best trainer in the world, but we've really had very little musculoskeletal injuries. And ironically, we've had 2 just really, really light strains, and it was our guys that were the least fit of the group. And it happened when we started to hit our highest training loads. And so we were able to kind of see that, scale it back, and now they're ready to play for the match on Friday. So I think that's kind of, this is where it really kind of comes into practice for us. And, it really starts to get fun. We start to try to predict our practices, and we kind of have a little go in the office, like if practice is supposed to be at 5:50, and then John comes in the next day and all of a sudden we're at, 5:33. It's, we're fired up because we're within, points of that practice. So it's been good. And it really allows us to focus on practices. One of the things too, is you'll see, like, our training loads get higher, but the players' feel of it is lower. So if guys were normally saying a 500 load felt like a 7, now as we're getting into week 7 and 8, they're saying it feels like a 5. And so that's pretty cool too, because that means they're able to sustain and handle higher workloads, and it's not as hard. At least they don't feel like it's as hard. So that's a lot of what we do. Also, what we do, which is a little bit outside of this, but it does help us with this, is we also space practices out. So we have to simulate what they're going to do in a game throughout a week of training, meaning, guys can run 40 yards at high speed. They have to have quick little change of directions. So we have to mimic that. So we actually also make sure that we have drills that are both intensive, which is smaller space, and then have drills that are extensive, where they open up and stretch your legs out. So that would, prepare them so that they don't pull hamstrings or get overwork groins in the intensive unit. So we have to manage that too as well. So it's pretty complicated to put down a practice session per week, with intensive and extensive exercises, high training loads, low training loads. You want to teach them, you want it competitive, but this information really allows us to do a lot of that in what we do. I think the other thing, is just, there is a lot of information, and I don't mind us, the coaches, getting a lot of information. It's more about how we take it and disseminate it to the players. We talk obviously with our sports science, our strength and conditioning, and that's the other thing, our guys are lifting. So we want to match those up too with the lifting with our training. So if we think we're having a hard week with training, or even like this week with a game on Friday, we usually lift Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday before practice, because that helps us kind of get that out of the way so the guys don't gauge during practice. But then just speaking with Molly, we gave them Thursday and Friday off of weights so that they can go into the game and feeling fresh and ready to go. So there's a lot of conversations and communication that has to happen. Certainly Vince, myself, John, my staff, and our strength and conditioning people, Molly and them, do a great job. And so we really try to coordinate a lot of that and get through answers. And then the other thing, what we'll do is when guys are injured, getting them to work back. And so we do these things, just 6-second runs, and based on their fitness level, the distance can be longer or shorter. So they'll run for 6 seconds. They got to get, let's say it's just 20 yards. They've got 6 seconds to get to 20 yards. Then they'll rest for 6 seconds, and then they'll run 6 seconds again. And depending on where their fitness level is at, will determine how long they do it, what's the recovery, and then also the distance that they can cover. Because obviously the more distance that you can do in 6 seconds, the faster you are running. I think for the most part, that's basically how we use it. I think the main thing is just the micro and the macro. I've got to try to win games, but know that if I'm continuing to do it and overplay players, that it's going to catch me. I'm going to have losing games in the long run because they're going to develop injuries. But it's tough sometimes because, you want to have, you want to have the guys training hard and pushing the envelope. But this really allows us to give us a good parameter of where we can kind of stay. Certainly, if there are times where I have to throw that training load out and be like, no, we need a hard practice because the guys need to be pushed mentally, but then I got to understand, if I'm going to do that, what are the repercussions, and also what I might have to do a couple days later in training to slow that down. If there's any questions or anything, I'd be glad to answer any of them.
Yeah, great. Damon, thank you so much for that presentation. I think it's really helpful to hear things from the other side sometimes. Not that we're divided, clinician, coach, but to understand how you're processing the information and to make sure the way we're delivering it is in a way that actually helps instead of it just being noise throughout the season. So on that note, your athletic trainer, Vince, had a question. So he was wondering, how do you sort of interact with athletes around these numbers? If they have a load metric, do you tell athletes like what their load is for a given time period? Do you hold it back and just say, we've got it, let us manage it, you worry about playing well? How does that kind of interaction work for you guys?
Yeah, so we don't, like, if I notice things, I'll just say, hey, just looking at the numbers, you look like your output is high, so we might have to hold you out of a drill or two. I don't give them the specifics like, whoa, you're at 3,000 units this week. But we just basically have those conversations. Hey, you're kind of running high, you're running low. we need to get you a little bit more. And really what we do is, I try to do is say, look, it's really for the best interest of that individual. Because we either want to get them back on the field and get them more fit, or we're saying, hey, if we put you out here in this situation, you're going to get yourself injured right now if you're not recovered completely. So I think nowadays you have to definitely let that individual know that you're trying to do it in their best interest, and the science backs up what we're saying.
So Mary Steele from MSU PT is wondering, do you have a specific, meeting on a weekly basis with your athletic trainer, physical therapist, sort of sports scientist folks that you get together and try to chart this out for the week? Or is this something that's a bit more, as the data comes in, you make decisions? Just how does it kind of work from a structural perspective?
So we would meet, John Hamill, like I said, does great. He would kind of give us a number for the week and would start to kind of set goals for each day for us. And then we would start we meet every morning and talk training sessions. And so we were saying, okay, we've got a load of 450 today. That's a pretty light day. Here's some things that we want to do and accomplish. So we would, from a soccer standpoint, we would come out, I'd write out themes that we want to accomplish for the week as a soccer coach. Obviously all kinds of different drills, and then we start to match the drills with the themes and then with the training load. And then obviously I communicate with Vince on a daily basis too. We plan practice at say 9 to 10 in the morning. Usually by about, hopefully early afternoon, Vince has probably got in contact with the injured guy. Sometimes, things change from the day before. So then I know what the practice is, and I'll talk to Vince and say, hey, player A, what are your thoughts on him today? And he'll say, what do you got? And I'll say, well, there's no contact in the drills until say, 30 minutes in. He's like, okay, well then let's try to do him. We'll see what he does after 30 minutes, and then we'll assess from there. So I'll kind of fill Vince in. And what's good with Vince, and when you have continuity in athletic training, is they start to understand the drills too. If I tell Vince we're doing a possession drill, Vince might not be able to kick a soccer ball, but he knows what a possession drill is. So he kind of knows what our drills are. And so he knows, what we're trying to accomplish. So that's where the communication on a daily basis really helps.
And so the last question we've got coming in from Q&A is, are there protections put in place to make sure that this kind of data isn't used in recruiting or assessing potential of future players as they're working their way towards, MLS combine or potentially overseas offers? Or is this something that you would potentially share with outside sources if they requested, this kind of data?
We haven't had to do that too much. I have talked to professional coaches, and if it's something that's exemplary, that I know that the player isn't afraid to share, like, hey, his accelerated runs or his yo-yo test is through the roof, like those types of things. It's more in general terms, but we usually don't share specific data with them. Now, if the player requested to have it, I think it's, I would work with Vince and the trainers, but I wouldn't have a problem sharing it with him when he's done. So.
All right, well, great. Barring any other questions, I think that's all we've got. So I'll pass it back to Tracy, and she'll be able to close out the evening.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you, Coach Rensing, for that great talk and great advice that you've given. I'd also like to tell everyone happy Athletic Training Month, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Please remember to complete the survey so you can get your CEUs. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, Damon.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks, Damon. Great job.
Thank you.